Good morning, everyone. It's me, Julia Hochstadt. As promised, I'm logging in as close to 9 a.m. as I possibly could have. The drop-off situation in my house and was a little, sorry, I'm just trying to fix this a little bit. There we go. It was a few minutes delayed this morning, but I'm here and you're here, and welcome to everybody. It's an interesting time of year, right, where things start to get a little crazy. Not that they're not crazy the rest of the year. I am hosting 17 people at my house on Thursday, which is amazing. We're very fortunate that we have 17 people to be able to host, but that's a lot of people in close quarters. So we just tell everybody to, have a good time. Make sure you take a shower. You're going to be sitting very close to the person next to you at the table. Just kidding. Yeah, it starts to get a little nutty balancing all of the things and trying to get ready for the holiday. So welcome to all of you. And actually, that's a great segue into what I want to talk about today. Talking about boundaries. I'm going to talk about what they are, why they're important, why they matter, how they change, what changes when our boundaries change or when somebody else's boundaries change, and really how to sort of navigate and think about the whole thing. But they're complex, and I've been thinking that I wanted to have a talk about boundaries for a while, and it seemed like a good time with the holidays rapidly descending upon all of us. I have a lot of people in my practice talking for a couple of weeks, but especially over the last 2 weeks or so, in anticipation of whatever their Thanksgiving is going to bring. Seeing relatives that they haven't seen in a long time, or having to put up with cousins that they don't really get along with, or somebody who's newly single who doesn't want to entertain a whole lot of questions around their relationship status. I mean, you name it. Or dietary restrictions and who cooks what, and timing, and this time works for my family because we have young kids, but my family doesn't like to sit down until much later. It's a hard time of year, and also a wonderful time of year, right? So boundaries. What are boundaries, right? When you think of boundaries, yours or other people's, what comes to mind? The way that I think of boundaries are, they're invisible lines. Sometimes they're more visible than others, right? Sometimes they're things that we talk about. Sometimes they're things that we don't talk about. But it's the space, the literal, the figurative space that we hold around ourselves. Or that we may hold around our families, right? So this could be on an individual level, on a couple level, on a family level, but it's the space that we carve out, that we hold around ourselves to maintain our own space, right? For whatever it is that we want that space for. It could be emotional space, it could be, for some other kind of space, but think of space in here, making space for things that are important to us. And this can happen in a similar way, but also in really different ways in personal relationships versus professional relationships, right? So the professional relationships, the professional boundaries that I have with my clients in my practice might look very different than the personal boundaries that I maintain in my relationships with my family or my friends. And that's true for me personally. My boundaries are different in my work than in my personal life. So again, boundaries are the space that we carve out, the space that we hold or attempt to hold to keep space for ourselves for whatever purposes we may need. It's really like a metaphorical keep your distance, right, when it comes to other people. But I think it's an important consideration to think about what happens. So it's one thing for us to have a boundary, right? Think of a line that you hold, right? That you may not communicate to anybody. What's the impact of you maintaining that boundary on some of the other people that you have relationships with, right? Because there is an impact on other people. The boundary is meant for me, right? Because maybe it helps me tolerate a family member, right? Let's just say, or it helps me manage my relationship with my boss. But what's my boss's experience of me having that boundary, right? What's my family member's relationship of me kind of going like this, right? In a metaphorical way. There is an impact, right? Sometimes people perceive our boundaries. Sometimes they perceive our boundaries and they don't care. And sometimes they don't perceive our boundaries at all, right? And sometimes the metaphorical this is not enough for the other person to really pick up on our signal of, I have a boundary here. I don't want you to cross that line, or this space is important to me. I need you to stay back there, right? So what happens when we hold our boundaries, right? When we assert our boundaries? There's an impact, not always a negative impact, right? Sometimes the impact is the boundary gets held, you have the space that you need, and all is well, right? But it's also interesting to think about that as relationships, as people change and evolve, relationships change and evolve, so do boundaries, right? Boundaries can change and evolve, and they're fluid, right? They're meant to be whatever it is that we need for ourselves in the moment, or in that time frame of the relationship. But it's also interesting to think about what happens when our boundaries change, right? What's the impact for ourselves, but also what's the impact on our relationships? Sometimes the boundaries change and the relationship goes on and it's smooth sailing. And other times it's not that way, right? Because in any kind of system, right, and we can think of relationships as being systems, people get used to the flow of the system, right? But when one route in the system, right, when one boundary, let's say, gets changed, even slightly, there's not only an impact to the individual who's changing their boundary, right? There's an impact to the whole system. Sometimes it's totally fine, and other times it can be a little rocky, right? But when things change in a system, it can be difficult for some of those people that are involved, right? It can be a really welcome change to the person who needs to make that change for themselves, right? Maybe it's, I used to want to spend so much time with you, but actually I've needed to pull back, right? Maybe my kids require something different from me, or this relationship doesn't work as well for me as it once did, but I need to make a change. I can't see you 3 times a week. I need to pull back and only spend time with you once a week. And that could be, let's say, a phone call, right? I can only talk to you once a week as opposed to 3 times a week, and that's what's best for me. The other person might be offended by that. Their feelings might be hurt by that. They might feel angry about that, right? There's been an impact to the entire system, even though the person who made the change was really doing what they needed to do, and it was most right for them, right? There are repercussions, right? So what's the impact on ourselves when our boundaries change? And also what's the impact on our relationships, right? And how do we manage all of that stuff? One thing about boundaries that I think it's important to talk about, excuse me, coffee break, is that it's up to us to hold our boundaries. And rest assured, if we do not hold our own boundaries, somebody else is going to blow right past them. Excuse me. And you guys can probably think of a lot of different examples, I certainly can, of boundaries that I have that I try really try very hard to hold them, and still sometimes people try to blow past them, right? At the end of the day, that's not right on their part, but it's still up to me to decide what's important for me and how am I going to communicate that either to myself or to the other person that I'm in a relationship with, right? But I have to own my boundaries because nobody else is going to. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. But what's the impact here when we have boundaries, which we try to maintain, and other people don't want to hear about it? Oh, you don't like when your mother-in-law, I have a friend's example in my head as I was prepping for this. You don't like when your mother-in-law barges into the bathroom while you're in the shower, and oh, you have a clear shower curtain up in your bathroom. You don't like that? Well, too bad. Your mother-in-law needs to get something from the medicine cabinet, right? My friend was shocked. She does not have the kind of relationship with her mother-in-law that it's okay to barge into the bathroom while I'm in the middle of conditioning my hair, right? Not okay. But her mother-in-law needed something, right? So everybody had a need at the same time, and somebody blew past the other person's boundaries entirely, if she even gave them a thought at all. right? It's a silly example, maybe not so silly, but it's one of the ones that comes to mind for me. Sometimes when people blow past our boundaries, there's malice, right? Sometimes people just don't care, right? They see a boundary, they don't care about it. They have a need to. That's more important to them in the moment. They're gonna go. So sometimes there's malice. Sometimes there's bad intention when people intentionally blow past our boundaries. And other times it's really unintentional, right? That somebody may not be aware that there's a boundary there, may not be aware that they're crossing a line. Maybe this woman's mother-in-law has different kinds of boundaries in her life, or in her home, or in her home when she was growing up, or when she was raising her kids. And maybe there was actually no malice there at all. Maybe it was just a thoughtless kind of thing. But a really good example, and this is, again, literal, but also metaphoric at the same time. And I don't mean to be like talking in too much jargon here. But if there's a lock on that bathroom door, that's a really good way of asserting a boundary, right? That's a literal and figurative. Nope, this is a boundary. This is a space. I need you to stay behind that side of the door. I'm in the shower. I'm not wearing clothes. This is me time. Stay back, right? And so everybody in that example, I think, had a little bit of responsibility, right? In terms of holding the boundary, maintaining the boundary, respecting the boundary. Regardless of all of this stuff, I go back to, we are responsible for our own boundaries, right? Other people are responsible for their behavior, right? And it's important to be respectful whenever we can of other people's boundaries. But at the end of the day, I'm responsible for what my boundaries are. I'm responsible for cultivating them, right? And I'm also responsible for communicating them. That might be something that's difficult for me, right? I may not be somebody who's able to verbally communicate to my partner, this is a boundary that I have, but I'm responsible for working to find other ways to communicate them to my partner. Because I can't expect my partner to be a mind reader when it comes to my boundaries, right? What's important for me? What kind of safe space do I need? I'm responsible for owning my boundaries, cultivating them, and communicating them to my partner. I could ask for help with that, right? But ultimately that falls to me. And then I'm hopeful that other people, once they are aware of my boundaries, because they've made them aware of my boundaries, that they're going to be respectful of them. Right? Not always the case. Lots of times it is, right? But it's hard because it's not always the case. So we establish our boundaries, we enforce them, or we don't, right? We may really want something to be a boundary. We may really want to be communicating to somebody, this is what I need from you. And we might not be able to say that to them, right? And so what happens in the relationship if we're not getting our needs met because somebody else doesn't have a sense of where our line is and when they've crossed it? Do we have a sense of where our line is and when people cross it, and how are we letting other people know about that, right? So this is complex stuff, right? Dynamic stuff that's always happening between ourselves and the outside world, right? So here's another example. I see a provider, I see a fantastic chiropractor who I really, really like, but their practice is boundaryless, right? There are no limits to how many patients this office will schedule in a given time frame. I have no idea how they make their schedule, but I have to imagine that if a patient calls, asks for an appointment, no matter how many people call, my impression as a patient in the office is they say yes all the time. There are no boundaries. And so sometimes that means that if, I really need to be seen right now, I'm having a problem, the answer is always yes, right? Which is awesome sometimes for me as the patient. More often than not, what my experience is, and again, this is a lovely office, I really like the providers, is I make an appointment and I wait, 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 sometimes for an hour. And I don't know about you, but I don't have that kind of time. As much as I love this office and as much as my neck might be hurting me, I don't have that kind of time. If I call and I say, can I come in at 12:30? And you say, yes, we have an appointment for you. Come on in at 12:30, Julia. I want to be seen around 12:30. Maybe a few minutes beyond that. Okay, fair, fine. I don't want to be seen at 1:30. And I have very little patience for this at this point, and yet I keep going back there, right? So that's a different kind of conversation. But the point is that I can't imagine that this works for the providers in that office. Maybe it does. And if it does, I'm happy for them. They found something that works for them. But I don't know when they go home at the end of the day. I don't know if they get to take a lunch hour. They have a lunch hour where the office is closed, and you can be seen in that time also, which I had to take them up on a couple of weeks ago. I had a real emergency, and this is what got me thinking about boundaries in that office, was that as a patient, I consider 12 to 2, whatever, to be their protected lunchtime. But I called and got an appointment because I don't think that they're holding their boundaries. And so I, as the patient, sometimes reap the benefit of that, right? And I ask, because it seems like they have no boundaries, right? They'll see me anytime. Oh, you sure you want to come in Saturday morning, 3 o'clock in the morning? Come on in, we'll treat you then, right? Does that work for them? And I can tell you that sometimes, more often than not, it doesn't work for me as the patient, because if they are not enforcing boundaries of any kind, then it might mean that they're overscheduling, right? It might mean that they're taking on too much. And so patients have to wait for an hour. And I don't know if other patients in the office have the experience, but what if we all do, right? And what if collectively we decide we're not coming back here anymore, right? And they lose a whole contingent of patients. Now, again, this is a made-up example shooting off of a real-life experience that I have, but it's to emphasize the point that we are the keepers of our own boundaries. And if we don't keep them, if this office doesn't keep 12 to 2 for lunchtime, then patients like me are going to blow right past it all the time. And I'm sure that that happens. For me personally, it happened once because I had this emergency, but I have to imagine that if I wanted to do it again today for not an emergency, that I could call and ask. And that's not necessarily the right impression that we want people to have around our boundaries, right? So just food for thought. Speaking of food, it's holiday time, right? Thanksgiving is just around the corner, and then we all know that it just goes into overdrive from there. So holiday time and boundaries, right? How do our boundaries get pushed differently in holiday time than maybe at other times throughout the year? Maybe there's no difference, right? But maybe when anxieties are running high and family is in town and there's lots of people having sleepovers, and we need to get this sleeping bag, we need to get this set up, oh, Aunt so-and-so needs this for her diet, and this, it's a lot of stuff that's not necessarily happening to the same degree, let's say, throughout the rest of the year. But how are our boundaries pushed differently around holiday time? What do we need to do differently, if anything, to maintain our boundaries around holiday time? And how are our boundaries differently respected around holiday time? Maybe the people that I typically spend my time with are very respectful of my boundaries, but my Uncle Johnny is actually not, right? He doesn't care that that we're a nut-free home. They don't care that we're a shoes-off house, or that I don't like to hug, actually, that I prefer to just smile and wave, or, think of any kind of example, right, of somebody who doesn't really feel like they respect your boundaries where it is that you're coming from. And maybe you see them differently around holiday time than you otherwise do throughout the year. So here are some tips for how to hold your boundaries, right? What's the name of the game, right? What is this all about? So I have 3 tips, right? The first is you got to establish them, right? It's important to know your limits for all kinds of things, right? For bedtime, for my bandwidth for holiday shopping, maybe going to the mall, how many people can we fit in my house, how often can I speak to my sister, whatever the case may be. Think about what your boundaries are. Establish them for yourself. You deserve it, right? You are worth it. You deserve it. It's important. And again, nobody's going to do this for us. We've got to do this for ourselves. So establish your boundaries. Spend some time thinking about what they are, what you want them to be. This is not an easy task, right? And I would encourage you to write this stuff down. Go a step beyond thinking about it, right? Thinking about it is great, but write this out, right? You deserve this. Establish your boundaries is step one. Step two, again, write out a plan for how to maintain them. Not even so much a plan, but okay, so I need to speak to my brother less frequently or to my sister-in-law less frequently, right? Here's how I can maintain that boundary. I can have somebody else in my house answer the phone when I see the caller ID picks up and it's them. I can send a text message proactively that says, I'm going to be tied up for the next couple of hours, but I can call you at such and such a time, right? Put it back on your own terms. You establish the boundary, step one. Step two is to think about how you can maintain those boundaries, right? This is work that we have to do, right? So how am I going to maintain the boundary, but also how can I communicate the boundary to help in an effort to maintain it to whoever else might be involved? And again, I want you to write out an actual list, right? Some action items around maintaining, holding a boundary that you've identified in step number one. Number three, right? And this is really tough stuff. I appreciate that this is not necessarily easy or intuitive for lots of people, but step three is share this information with anybody who can be helpful, right? Maybe that's a partner, maybe that's your kids, maybe that's your parents, maybe that's the person or the people who are going to, in the system, right, be impacted by this boundary. Let's say you decide, hey guys, I got a lot of work to do getting ready for Thanksgiving. So lights out for me in my bedroom where I sleep is going to be 9:15 p.m. So kids, that's going to mean you're going to have to do X, Y, and Z to get yourselves ready for bed. If you want me to tuck you in, I'm happy to do that. It's got to be before 9:15. Hubby, you're going to have to watch TV downstairs, right? You're going to have to watch TV somewhere else. You're going to have to watch TV in our bedroom with your headphones on, because lights out in our room is going to be 9:15, right? So establishing your boundaries, thinking about how to maintain them, and then sharing that information with other people who can help you hold this boundary, right? So for example, people who might be able to help: your kids, your partner, your family, your colleagues, right? All people who you may want to have some kind of communication with about your plan of action. And it doesn't have to be like so formal, right? Where I sit down and I say, listen, Jim, in the office, here's my boundary around the copy machine, right? It doesn't have to be exactly like that. It could be a lot less formal. But the point is that you're thinking about these things actively and you're communicating them effectively, or as effectively as you possibly can, to other people to help ensure that they get maintained. So let's see, I have a closing sentence down here on my paper, which I can't quite see at the moment. In other words, right, and in summary, having boundaries, holding them, especially around holiday time, it doesn't magically happen, right? It's not like we think it and a magic wand gets waved and poof, there they are, right? And everybody knows about them and respects them and we all get along, right? If it were only that easy. It takes work, right? Establishing our boundaries, making that space for ourselves, holding that space for ourselves, for whatever it is that we need that space for, takes work. And frankly, your sanity, my sanity, is worth it. It's worth the work, it's worth the effort, but it's hard. And with that, I wish all of you out there a very happy Thanksgiving holiday. I hope that it's filled with wonderful boundaries that are kept and maintained and respected, yummy food to eat, drinks to drink for those of you who will be partaking. And really, I just hope that everybody has a very happy, healthy holiday season. May we all stay calm and relaxed in the process. And as always, if anybody has any feedback or questions or comments, you can reach out to me directly on Facebook, or you can find me and more information about my practice at my website, www.therapywithjulia.com. Take care, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving. Bye-bye.